Halo fans love one thing, besides Halo 2 of course, it's theorizing. You know, we've not really had much else to do in recent years, so I think it's fair to say we've gotten pretty good at it. And so today, in that vein, I want to talk about where Halo's story goes from here. I want to talk about where I really want it to go, and also more specifically about what style of story Halo Infinite sequel should be, in terms of both its actual story type, but also its atmosphere, its aura, its tone, and its setting, because these are things that are equally as important as the story itself in creating a believable, immersive, and above all else, a lovable world. Right, to begin, I want to talk less about specifics and more about the kind of broad direction of the story, starting out with something that I actually really want the next campaign to start to move away from: the mantle of responsibility. Now granted, if our theories about the Endless being a precursor subspecies who believe that none of their creations deserve the mantle and want to reclaim it for themselves are indeed correct, then the mantle is gonna have to be a core element of the story again, but you know, to be honest, given the context of its inclusion in that case, I'd be so down for that. I love that potential direction for the Endless. That said though, if that theory doesn't end up being true, then I really do hope that the story focuses on something other than the mantle for once. For the most part, every main story now for the past 12 years has revolved around the mantle. Halo 4 revolved around the Didact trying to seize it, Halo 5 revolved around Cortana trying to seize it, and Infinite, at least in part, revolved around Cortana failing to seize it. I just think it's time that the overarching narrative shifted to something else. Personally, I really miss when Halo's story was about averting an impending apocalypse, either Covenant-caused, Flood-caused, or even both put together. I mean, you really can't get higher stakes than the end of the galaxy. Now, there are ways of doing this apocalypse story with the Banished, or the Endless for sure, even though we don't quite know the Endless's motivations yet. If our theories are correct about them, and they indeed do think that they should hold the mantle, then surely, as the Harbinger's intentions kinda showed in Halo Infinite, they'd be willing to destroy anybody or anything that gets in their way, like humanity inevitably will do. And so, in a way, you could kinda merge the mantle and the apocalypse stories with the Endless, but again, that's all entirely theoretical for now. As for the Banished, it'd be very easy to introduce some galaxy-ending Foreigner MacGuffin, or hell, even better yet, some galaxy-ending Endless MacGuffin, as contrived as that risks being that they happen to be after. But when it comes to talking about the apocalypse in Halo, the absolute best way to do a story like that is, of course, with the Flood. Halo's lore has cemented the Flood as the ultimate persistent threat. They are an ever-present, ever-looming, extinction-level threat to the galaxy and all of its species. As a certain purple man once said, they are inevitable. And you know, when you boil Halo's story down to its most simple components, from both the Foreigner era of the galaxy and even the modern day of the Halo galaxy, it's always been about trying to prepare for what is essentially a glorified zombie apocalypse with the Flood. And now that we've had a very long break from that narrative, I really want Halo's main story to start to refocus on it, because I just think there's so much more they could do with the concept of a galactic zombie apocalypse. There's so much they could do with that that's never been tapped into. Moving on to settings, there are two locations that I really want us to go back to under now radically different circumstances that are actually kind of connected: Reach and the Ark. Returning to an entirely glassed Reach upwards of a decade after it happened would lead to some really interesting character development for, of course, Chief, but you know what, honestly, the main reason I want to go back to Reach is to see Chief go there with the Arbiter. Now, we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I would do literally anything at this point to see an interaction between these two on Reach, considering that Chief fought and lost many fellow Spartans defending it from the Arbiter's fleet, who carried out the bulk of the assault and the glassing. Bit of a tangent here, but that's why I kinda wish that the Shadows of Reach story hadn't been on Reach. I really wish that Chief's first time going back to Reach after Reach itself happened had been with the Arbiter in a game. I just think it would have been so much more impactful, but either way, that's by the by now. Regardless, I really want the two to go back to Reach together in a game. But that's not the only reason I want to go back. Thanks to Shadows of Reach, we now know that Reach is home to the only other known Arc portal in the galaxy, the High Noon facility from Reach's DLC, and I think going to the Arc via Reach would just be such a cool plot thread, as well as also the Arc being a really cool place to explore. It's such a vast and yet still massively unexplored location that would be such an amazing setting for another FPS game. Of course, we had Halo Wars 2, but there's only so much you can do with environmental exploration in an RTS. You kind of have to use an FPS to really flesh out an environment like that. And speaking of Halo Wars 2, beyond its unexploredness, if that's even a word, the Arc is still home to the Spirit of Fire crew. Now, I feel like this is every Halo fan's pipe dream at this point, but for good reason. I really want to see at least some of the Spirit of Fire crew make their way into the mainline story. I want to see an interaction between Cutter and Lasky or Lord Hood, but I gotta say, more importantly, I want to see an interaction between Chief and Red Team. There really aren't that many Spartan 2s left nowadays, at least as far as I can remember, and so for Chief to meet a still functioning squad who've been MIA for 30 years at this point, or at least coming on 30 years, would make for a really interesting bit of story. It could also be a great way to soften most normie Halo fans up to Jerome, given how many people want Jerome to carry on Chief's torch when Steve Downes inevitably retires, but that's a different topic for a different day. Moving on to a topic that is fit for every single day of the year, the Arbiter. We need the Arbiter to come back. I know you've heard this 1,000 times before, but honestly, I'm not going to stop talking about it until the Arbiter actually returns. He's the one character that needs to come back as a mainstay, and to be honest, I don't really think I need to explain why. The real question is, though, how would the Arbiter come back, and what would his role be? Well, I gotta say, I actually really liked how they did the Arbiter's role in Halo 5. Yes, you're hearing a very rare bit of Halo 5 praise coming from your boy. So in Halo 5, he was the leader of the Swords of St. Helios, so he filled the kind of commander role that you'd expect. But at the same time, he also remained a warrior and fought alongside you and his elites on the battlefield in levels, and this is exactly how I'd want him to be done in Halo 7. Honestly, I think it'd really suck if RB got the same treatment as Halfjaw got in Halo 3, where he was demoted to just having a presence in cutscenes thanks to his commander role. I think it'd be an absolute sacrilege to have Arbiter in a game and not get to fight alongside him, and to stretch that even further actually, to have him in a game and not play as him, but again, more on that in a bit. But of course, the Arbiter can't just return all by himself, he's got to bring the Swords of St. Helios with him as well. Now, as far as the game goes, the Swords of St. Helios are massively underdeveloped, which is really weird given their equal importance to the UNSC in kind of the end of Halo 2 and the entirety of Halo 3. Now, of course, yes, several books have fleshed them out, but they need that same treatment in the games as well, especially if they're going to be a mainstay, as they absolutely should be. Granted, this would be the absolute perfect thing to base a spin-off game on. I mean, an Arbiter / Swords of St. Helios Souls-like game? I mean, that's begging to be made at this point, but we've done this spin-off talk to death now. A great way to flesh the swords out in a main game would be to bring back Artas, Entho, Utse, and also Tul'Juran from Shadow of Intent to give the Swords of St. Helios their own lineup of main characters to match the UNSC's cast of characters, and to also ensure that the faction doesn't just kind of revolve entirely around the Arbiter. I think in the games that was one thing they always lacked. The main characters were like Arbiter, Halfjaw, and that's kind of it, whereas the UNSC had like Chief, Cortana, Miranda, Lord Hood, and many other characters as well. They need their own kind of central line of characters. Honestly, the Swords of St. Helios should have been present in every single post-Halo 3 game, if you ask me. They're now our #1 ally in the galaxy. I mean, we literally saved the galaxy with them. We saved everything in the galaxy with them by our side, and our alliance is one of Halo's most unique plot threads, something that you really don't get in many other similar sci-fi stories. Fighting alongside elites and having elite main characters as a part of the main character lineup should be a very common occurrence in modern Halo. But honestly, I want the next game to go beyond elites. I want more than just elite allies. We know that the Swords have grunts in their ranks, so I think it's safe to assume that there are other Covenant species and other factions that are allied with them that include jackals and hunters at the very least. Allied aliens in general should have been a mainstay post-Halo 3 if you ask me. They make the galaxy seem so much more rich and expansive, and they hone in on some of the most unique aspects of Halo's universe that no others can boast. I mean, the fact that this moment in Halo 2 is the only time that we've ever had friendly hunters, and that this is the only time that we've ever fought alongside jackals is criminal. Halo's alien racers acting as our brothers in arms is a side of their species-wide character that is vastly underdeveloped and vastly slept on. Halo is about far more than just fighting alongside Marines. The universe goes so much deeper, and having allies of all different races is a great way to show that off within the gameplay. Something else that's extremely deep is the internet, but with depth, as we know with the Halo universe, comes threats. But thanks to NordVPN, today's sponsor, you'll be more protected than a Halo 2 brute on Legendary. Of course, being a VPN, NordVPN lets you pop the online privacy equivalent to active camouflage to evade region locks and browse any region's content from anywhere in the world. But it also comes with Threat Protection Pro, which offers digital protection from malware and online threats coming from all kinds of sources. Downloads and links? Well, Threat Protection scans them for malware, fraud, and scams. Annoying pop-ups? Well, it also blocks ads as well for a smooth browsing experience, all while beefing up your security even when you aren't connected to a VPN. Just enable it, and it works at all times. NordVPN also helps to protect you from man-in-the-middle attacks, where your data is harvested by malicious individuals when connecting to public Wi-Fi networks. Nord encrypts your online traffic at all times to ensure that nobody can get a hold of it. So activate your permanent digital overshield while browsing the web by going to nordvpn.com/Xperia to get an exclusive NordVPN deal and also 4 months extra. It's even risk-free as well with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/Xperia. Another character that I just need to see, and that thankfully by all intents, fingers crossed we should do, is Offensive Bias. For the longest time, hardcore fans like us have wanted elements of the Forerunner trilogy to weave into Halo's main story, for it all to kinda come full circle, and the Offensive Bias tease at the end of Infinite felt like that wish was finally becoming a reality. I will never forget my reaction to first hearing that line.
Offensive Bias has been deployed.
I feel like having a character as enigmatic as Offensive Bias play a significant role in a game is a great way to inject some of that old intrigue and mystery that the Forerunners used to elicit back into the story. This might sound a little bit strange, but Mendicant Bias and Offensive Bias in particular almost feel like the physical character embodiment of the Halo 3 terminals to me, or rather of the cryptic and esoteric vibe that those terminals had. They're these great, massively significant, enigmatic, and to a degree, incomprehensible entities, their intelligence beyond our wildest comprehension, and their stories so vast and important that they just have this aura of insurmountable importance and intrigue about them. And I think their presence in a story would do wonders for its aura. But again, more on aura soon. Another group of individuals that have a similar strength aura about them are the Prophets, and I would love to see the Prophets come back in some capacity. Now, don't get me wrong here, I don't want them to just recreate the Covenant, but the political intrigue and scheming that came with the Prophets was a really unique aspect of Halo that we just don't get at all anymore. The closest that we ever got to that was the cutscene in Halo Wars 2 about Atriox's backstory, which was a really sick cutscene, but it's not quite the same. Nobody does that conniving political intrigue like the Prophets. That said, I have no idea really how they could bring the Prophets back with that intrigue and not just end up retreading the Covenant steps. I mean, I guess they could have like a splinter group of Prophets who follow a different religion to the Great Journey, but even still, that'd feel very reminiscent. Probably too reminiscent. The one way that they could at least kind of bring them back that would feel totally different would be to introduce the Sanshayum Prelates. So the Prelates were these things that were first mentioned all the way back in the description of Halo 2's DLC map Gemini in like 2007, I want to say, and have since been heavily fleshed out in various books, but have never once been present in the games. So if you don't know what these Prelates are, well, they're, to put it lightly, quite insane. They're Prophet super soldiers, bioengineered with incredible agility and combat prowess that were designed by the Covenant to be their answer to the Spartans, and they are quite unlike literally anything in the games right now, which is, to me, even more of a reason to add them. They're Prophets, but with a huge, new, unique twist. I think the Prelates would be perfect to be in a game. Okay, let's talk broader aura, themes, tone, atmosphere, and vibes now. And the one tone that I don't want, I need to come back with a vengeance in the next campaign is horror. Adventure, mystery, and horror were the three core atmospheric pillars of Halo from the very get-go, but sadly that third pillar has been missing for the most part since Halo 3. Now, when you think of Halo and horror, of course the first thing that comes to mind is the Flood. They are long overdue a return, and I can't think of a more perfect way to bring horror back than in tandem with the Flood's return, but I mean, we all knew that already. You could also do horror without the Flood as well. In fact, I'd actually love to see some Halo horror that's not based on them. The only time that we ever really saw that was with the horrific depiction of the Brutes in Stomping on the Heels of a Fuss in Halo Evolutions. That story is a very violent and very unsettling depiction of the Brutes, and I think that style would fit the Banished really well. The Endless would work really well with horror as well. Thanks to that one audio log in Halo Infinite where Lucas Browning gets interrogated by the Harbinger, it really got me thinking that they could do some really great kinda mystery-based fear and psychological horror story beats with the Endless. Psychological horror is actually one of the few types of horror that Halo doesn't ever really touch on, but with the Endless, maybe now's the time. Piggybacking off all of this, I really want the kind of overall tone of the next campaign to be a lot more mature, and that's not influenced by any nostalgia from any previous Halo game. The only Halo games that I'd really consider mature are Halo 2, Halo Reach, and Halo 4, but even then, they're not quite mature in the sense that I mean. It's really hard to put into words the kind of vibe that I'm talking about here. I think if I had to use some examples of the kind of matureness that I'd want, I'd say maybe take some inspiration from Gears of War, Sicario, and Aliens. And you know, on that note, I also really want the next story, and by extension the next game, to up the grit and the gore a bit. I just want the overall world to feel more mature than it currently does, whilst also keeping that atmosphere of kind of fantastical adventure that Halo is known so well for. And when it comes to grit and gore, I honestly don't think that there's a single better faction in the entire franchise, besides maybe the Flood, to do it with than the Banished. In hindsight, I think the way that they characterized and actually designed the Brutes in Halo Infinite was a bit soft, so to speak. I'd love to see them taken down a much darker and more disturbing path that leans more into some of the horrific stuff that the Brutes as a species are known for, and that also has them draped in much darker, more imposing brutalist armor like the Uruk-hai-inspired concepts for the Banished Brutes in Halo Wars 2 over the kinda cleaner, brighter colours that their armor got in Halo Infinite. Uruk-hai designed Brutes complete with their canonical violent tendencies would be so peak that the peak would have its own peak and those dudes would be sat on it. Now this is a shorter point, but I really hope the backs against the wall vibe that Infinite properly brought back gets continued in the next game. During Halo 4 and Halo 5, the UNSC and humanity in general just felt too much like dominant juggernauts. I really liked that Infinite essentially just reality checked them, even if, you know, the logistics of that reality check are still a little nonsensical. That said, I hope this vibe transcends beyond just Chief, the weapon, and the pilot. I want it to be felt much more broadly across the allies in general. I loved how the desperation in Halo 3 transferred over to the Arbiter and the Elites as well. It wasn't just the UNSC feeling it, and I really want the next game to bring that back. And that leads very nicely into my next hope, for the game to have a much larger cast of characters and for it to transcend the now infamous Chief-focused narrative. Now this is a super long shot, but I would do so many things for another Halo 2 styled campaign where Chief is of course present and important and gets a lot of screen time, but where the main focus is on the story arc of another character, specifically one within the enemy faction. And honestly, with how much the Banished seem to have changed from being a kind of morally grey area faction in Halo Wars 2 to a more Covenant-esque evil faction in Infinite, I think it'd be the perfect faction for a story like that, about maybe a once devout member of the Banished who finds themselves slowly becoming disillusioned as their faction starts to grow similarities with the Covenant, of whom of course they formed to split from. I absolutely adored Infinite's Banished cutscenes. They were legit the biggest surprise when I first played the campaign, but they felt also at the same time like the biggest tease because they were the only time that we ever got an insight into the enemy faction. I want more of that, but for it to be kind of interwoven with a protagonist so we feel more invested because, well, we're playing through that story arc ourselves. That, and also just on a more simple level, playing as a member of the quote-unquote evil faction and seeing their inner workings is always just so cool, man. I love any story that does that. But that was a semi-tangent. Beyond an evil second protagonist, I just kind of want more varied main characters in the lineup. Characters that aren't just human as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I criticised Halo 5 for years for having way too many main characters, and I definitely don't want a repeat of that, because if you have too many main characters, then, well, you get Halo 5's story where there's not enough time to develop any of them. But at the same time, it's no secret that Infinite, very intentionally, I think, had very few main characters. Honestly, I think the sweet spot was Halo 2 and Halo 3. Both games had a really good number of characters on both sides of the war, but not so many main characters that any of them were neglected, for the most part at least, and I really want that sweet spot to be met again. Now, this next point kind of piggybacks off the whole Chief-focused narrative thing again, and it's a broader hope for the style of narrative that we get. I kind of want 343 to move away from their typical character study kind of story. Pretty much every single one of their stories has been a kind of character study in some capacity, and don't get me wrong, I liked Halo 4 and Infinite's attempts at doing that style of story, but I gotta be honest, I'm really tired of being reminded that the Chief is a human, right? And that he's got feelings and that we need to deconstruct him and analyze all of those feelings. I'm really, really tired of that story now, at least when it pertains to Chief. If we were to get, say, another Halo 2 style story with protagonists in opposing factions, then yeah, I'd be super down for the other protagonist story to be done in that character study style, just how Bungie did with the Arbiter in Halo 2. However, if that isn't what we get, which, better or worse, I think is the more likely option, then I'd much rather the story have a more bombastic 80s action movie style of story, more akin to like Halo 3's story, with a wider focus on a greater number of characters and ideas, rather than tunnel visioning in on a very small number of plot devices like, say, Infinite. I don't dislike that style of story by any means, I'm just really bored of it now because it's really all we've had for 12 years. And finally, this one probably should have gone at the start, but honestly it kind of ties together both the first and the second section of this video really nicely, so we're talking about it here. I really want a new character or an existing character to come in and fill the Sergeant Johnson role. Now, don't get me wrong, Sergeant Avery Johnson is an utterly irreplaceable character. However, his style of character and the emotions that he elicited can be replicated with somebody new. Johnson was funny, he was badass, he was full of bravado and charisma, he was the perfect embodiment of the 80s action movie hero, and we need someone to fill that role again because with its absence, much like horror, it really feels like a core emotional pillar of Halo is missing. Now, I've thought about who could fill this Johnson-esque role very long and very hard. Maybe the pilot could fill it now that he's been through his defeatist to courageous character arc, but I don't know, I'm not quite sure the pilot fits that kind of role. Finding someone to fill that role is really tough because you can't have a character just one-to-one replicate Johnson because all that's going to happen then is they'll come off as a pale imitation and will forever be compared to the likely superior Johnson. So you need someone who's fundamentally different, but that also shares similar characteristics. Honestly, it's really far-fetched and it won't ever happen, but the only character that I can think of that comes to mind who I think could fill this role very well and also rather organically is Buck. He has that kind of same charm and clever wit to Jonathan, and overall he just kind of feels like a similar character archetype to Jonathan. He's by no means identical, and he wouldn't be a one-to-one replication of Jonathan, but he definitely elicits many of the same emotions that Jonathan did, so if I had to pick anyone, I'd say Buck would be the perfect fill. Man, I really wish they hadn't made Buck a Spartan. Could you imagine the four-way lineup of Chief, the Weapon, ODST Buck, and the Pilot? Oh my god, that would slap so hard. Even more so if, like, every now and then the Arbiter popped in as well. I wish, man, I wish. Let me know who you think would fill this role well in the comments. I was also gonna say Sergeant Forge as well, because he would fit that role really well, but, well, you know. And with that said, let's round this one out there. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there as per usual. Thank you all very much, and thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Hopefully I'll be seeing a load of you at the Halo World Championships in Seattle next week. I will be there, and I promise I don't bite, so if you see me, come up, say hi. I'd love to meet as many of you as possible. So thank you all for watching. I'll hopefully see you there, and I'll catch you all in the next one. And at Worlds in a week.